Good morning. The topic, as Amy said for this morning, is wealth without work. So I'll be talking today mostly about money later on, but I wanted to acknowledge that there are many different kinds of wealth. You can have a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of love, a wealth of friendship or good health. Something that many, if not most, Unitarian Universalists have, including me, is a wealth of privilege. I'm not characterizing that as good or bad, I'm just making the observation. In the news recently, you probably have heard the name Brock Turner, also known as the Stanford rapist. He was caught in the act of raping an unconscious young woman. And the two guys who caught him detained him there until the police arrived. He was not UU, but being in possession of a wealth of privilege, he was sentenced to only 6 months jail time. His father, as well as many, many other people, will tell you that even that slap on the wrist sentence was too harsh for what was no more than 10 minutes of bad behavior when compared to the rest of his life. Where I am right now on this day in my personal spiritual development is this. You can have an alphabetized list that is dozens of pages long, detailing all of Brock Turner's good qualities. But for me, that one line item, those terrible 10 minutes, outweighs all the rest of the good, because at the end of the day, no matter how much good he has done in his life, or how much good he may do in the future, there was another person involved in those 10 minutes. For me, it's not about Brock Turner at all. I am willing to acknowledge that he is sorry, and I'm willing to acknowledge that he realizes what he did was wrong, unlike many men who are guilty of the same crime. Nobody is purely good or purely evil, but for me, those 10 minutes of bad behavior are always going to outweigh everything that I freely acknowledge is good about him. As a gay man, and as a person of color, and as someone who grew up in poverty, I have been on the receiving end of bad behavior by American politicians of both major parties for most of my life. I'm very different in that regard from most Unitarian Universalists. I hold all politicians, regardless of their gender, or their age, or their race, or their political affiliation, to the same standard as Brock Turner. And what matters to me the most is not the individual politician, but rather the lives that they have affected. When I see a guy who has spent most of his career working against equal pay for women, I remember being raised by a single woman, and I remember being hungry sometimes because our refrigerator was empty. When I was a child during the 1970s, this was most politicians all over the country, right? Most were not in favor of paying women equally. Today, in my adult life, when that same guy who is still in politics has recently seen the light, perhaps because he's running for higher public office, perhaps not. But now he says, you know what? I've changed my mind. Women should be paid equally. Obviously, I was wrong. I'm willing to commend him for his personal growth, even if I feel a little bit sarcastic about it. But when he wants me to vote for him, I don't think about the laundry list of good things that he has done or that he's likely to do. I remember being hungry. And more important than that, I remember keeping that a secret from my mom. I knew that if our refrigerator was empty, my mom would just cry if I told her that I was hungry. So instead of saying anything to her, I just go lay down on my bed. Since for most of my life, most politicians have worked against gay people and against people of color, I have in most primaries and in most elections been faced with voting for the lesser of two evils. It is rare that I've had the opportunity to look at a political candidate's history and not found one of those periods of bad behavior that, for me, outweighs all the good that they have done in their career. In my opinion, this is why many people don't vote at all. What I have noticed is that most people who are willing to give the Brock Turners of American politics a free pass, those that are willing to focus more on the good that a politician has done or promises to do, those kinds of voters tend to be in possession of a wealth of privilege. For better or for worse, that's how our government works. I have never actually been raped, but when I was 18 years old, and again when I was 25, I very narrowly escaped being sexually assaulted. The fact that I'm a man who is 6'2" is not what saved me. It certainly didn't discourage it from happening in the first place. And it was my obstinate personality characteristics combined with my size and strength that saved me when I was 18. And it was a security guard in the bar where I was waiting for some friends that saved me when I was 25. Weirdly, in both instances, I was being forcibly dragged into a bathroom, clearly against my will, by a man who was older and larger and stronger than I. I really believed that my personal brush with nearly being raped twice is at least part of what drives the rage that I feel when I read about people like Brock Turner. The more privilege that you have, the less experience you tend to have with adversity. Great privilege and the lack of adversity that comes with it often translates into empathy, but not enough empathy to move people to act. There are Unitarian Universalists all over this country who would never in a million years vote for a political candidate who had spent most of their career being outspokenly critical of interracial marriages. They just wouldn't do it. But I'll tell you, there are huge numbers of Unitarian Universalists who are eager to vote for candidates who have worked against same-sex marriage for most of their careers. And what does that say about us as a community? For those of us that have been hungry, to use that example instead, it's not about a particular candidate's good or bad qualities, it's about the damage and the suffering that continues to exist even though that particular candidate has finally seen the light. I have health problems that I deal with every single day that stem directly from my impoverished upbringing. I am just not going to vote for a guy who has spent most of his career working against equal pay for women. I don't care how enlightened he is today. You as a majority do seem to understand that about me, but when I make the same analogy about politicians and same-sex marriage, that has been met with both astonishment and derision. When you are a prominent politician and you spend most of your career debasing same-sex couples and their children, you help to shape the culture of violence that exists toward people like me. And in cases like the Orlando shooting, I believe it has much more to do with what the shooter listened to his whole life growing up about people like me, more than anything anyone could have said in the few days previous to the shooting. Brock Turner and his father probably believe that people like me are a little bit extreme in our views, and maybe we are. I might be less extreme if I had grown up straight in a white, educated, English-speaking household with enough money. There's just no way to know. What I do know is that ignoring someone's flaws because their good traits are so similar to yourself, that can be disastrous. My grandparents were swindled out of a small chunk of money by some Mexican guy that they barely knew. But like my grandfather, he was Mexican. And like my grandfather, he spoke Spanish much better than he spoke English. So when their white Jewish accountant told them, this is not a good idea, I would not do this, they did it anyway. They generalized. They knew that this Mexican guy had probably done some questionable things in his past, but his experience of life in general was so much more similar to theirs than what their accountant's was, that they convinced themselves that everything would work out for the best. My grandparents never knew wealth without work. They worked hard, starting in early childhood. There's a saying that, I'm not sure if this is a Spanish saying or if I just learned it first in Spanish, but it asks, ¿Está siendo dirigido por tu espíritu o tu herida? And that translates as, are you being led by your spirit or by your wound? I found some interesting research on wealth without work that I'd like to share with you all this morning, but I want to start by highlighting the difference between $1 million and $1 billion. If you had 1 million $1 bills and you set fire to 1,000 bills a day, it would take you over 3.5 years to burn $1 million. If you did the same thing with $1 billion, set fire to 1,000 bills a day, it would take you almost 4,000 years to burn $1 billion. That's how much more $1 billion is than $1 million. So try to keep that analogy in mind as I'm throwing around those words, $1 million and $1 billion today. It is well established that economic advantages and disadvantages are passed from one generation to the next. But a recent study that was done in Italy points to much longer lasting effects of income inequality on economic mobility. They studied the tax records in Italy from 1427 to 2011, so almost 600 years of tax records, right? And what they discovered is that among the top earners in the modern 2011 taxpayers, those were the same families as the top earners back in 1427. Italy has experienced enormous political, economic, and social upheavals that have rocked the country over and over again during those 600 years, and still those same families remain in that top earning bracket. The thing about piles of wealth anywhere in the world is that they deliver to their owners unworked for passive income variously called rents, dividends, capital gains, interest, and so on. In United States history, most people who became very well off inherited their money. They did not work for it, they inherited it. That's true right now, and it has been true for most of our country's history. The weird exception to this rule of inherited wealth is the 1950s, the 60s, and the 70s. During those 3 decades, a majority of people who became very well off worked for the money that put them into that category. That still happened for a while for a lot of people, well into the 1980s, but not for a majority of people, as it had in the preceding 3 decades. A consistent fact all over the world is that people who are very well off today, their wealth often began in the past. And it wasn't necessarily wealth then, but it certainly is today. Now, if you own property that is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars or more, but you have to be careful with your actual cash, because owning physical assets does not necessarily translate into spendable cash, right? Here's a troubling statistic. 63% of Americans say that they are unable to afford a surprise $500 car expense or a surprise $1,000 medical bill. 63%, they just don't have the extra cash. I had to verify that multiple times because even I just couldn't believe that things have gotten that bad. Not to labor the point, because I've talked about this in some of our churches, but right after I was born, my father left us, never to be seen again. And that plunged my older brothers and my mom and me into abject poverty for nearly the next 20 years. I dug through a grocery store dumpster for food when I was in kindergarten. We were that poor. And I had been able to handle a surprise $500 expense for decades, but most Americans cannot. I've always stood up for the equal rights of women, specifically because I dug through a dumpster for food as a child. One of the biggest reasons that my brothers and I had to do that is because our mom was not paid fairly, nowhere near fairly, in the 1960s and the 1970s. And all 4 of us had to live off of her one really pathetic income. Through the 1970s, my mom's income was never more than half of what her male coworkers made for exactly the same work. I know from personal experience what it's like for women not to be paid fairly. I lived that nightmare every single day for the first 17 years of my life. A lot of people in my generation fell into a trap that we never saw coming. I'm loosely defining my generation as people who were children at any point in the 1970s. When we were growing up in the 70s, we knew that our grandparents' generation didn't even have to finish high school, and they still got jobs that paid them enough to buy houses with yards here in crazy expensive California. And then they retired at a decent age, and they did this without any financial help from their families or their parents. Both sets of my grandparents did that right here in California, and half of them never finished high school. They didn't have luxurious homes, but they owned houses with yards, not condos, in Los Angeles and up near San Francisco. It's not like they lived out in the boondocks. And they were not at all unusual compared to their peers. My parents' generation absolutely did have to finish high school in order to accomplish that American home buying and later early retirement, or decent retirement. But they only had to go to college if they wanted to work in a profession that required college, or if they wanted a home and a lifestyle that were both something better than what their parents had had, but again, without any kind of financial help from their families. Everybody in my generation assumed the same would be true for all of us. Oh my goodness, things have not worked out at all like any of us have ever expected. I looked at minimum wage tables for California, and also UCLA tuition and other fees, both going back several decades, to arrive at the following numbers. When my parents were college age, 18 to 22, a guy like me working a minimum wage job could afford on that salary to pay for myself and 19 other people to get an undergraduate degree from UCLA. When I was college age, I did work a minimum wage job, and I could afford on my salary to pay for myself and 8 other people to go to UCLA. So down from 19 to 8, right? This is how extreme things have gotten for the next generation. Today at UCLA, tuition and other fees will run you $14,500 a year. To have the equivalent opportunity that I had, to be able to pay for yourself and 8 other people to go to school there, today's minimum wage workers would have to make $116,000 a year, or nearly $56 an hour. To have my parents' generation's opportunity of paying for yourself and 19 other people to go to school there, today's minimum wage workers would have to make almost $276,000 a year for a 40-hour work week. That's how extreme things have changed from my parents' generation to mine, to my children, if I had any. This is how, in my case, being gay kind of saved me. It put me in a better financial place than many of my peers. By the time I realized in my late 20s that I was going to have to finish college in order to be able to maybe afford the lifestyle of previous generations, most of my heterosexual friends had already gotten legally married and had children. At this time, not even domestic partnership was an option for Americans like me, much less legal marriage. I certainly didn't have the responsibility of children. So it wasn't that hard for me to scale down from a gigantic apartment that I lived in all by myself, and I just rented a room in someone else's home while I finished undergrad. I finished my degree when I was almost 31 years old, but by then it was already too late to be able to buy a home unless you could borrow money from family to help you. All of my peers who bought homes were only able to do so with family help. And nowadays, most people seem to think that that's like a normal thing to do. No matter how frugally I lived and how much I saved, the price of real estate kept going up and up, so that every year, my savings each time was out of reach for what was typically called a starter home. Every year, it was enough for what starter homes had cost about 4 or 5 years earlier. My experience, unfortunately, fits all of this. So many people are nodding. I love it. My experience, unfortunately, fits all of the statistics that I've been able to find on this subject. If you were born, get this, if you were born into a well-off family, you were 250 times more likely to be a high-income earner, even if you do not go to college, than someone like me who did go to college, but who started life not so well off. When I speak about these topics, I've been asked more than once, so how did you come to buy such a nice house, Lawrence, and get a great job and finish college and all of that? Because that is my life. And the answer is, and I hate saying it like this, but it's true, I married up. I married into the middle class. More accurately, I domestically partnered up. And then we were able to marry several years later. Marrying up was not my intent. I didn't realize that that's what I was doing. Because when my husband and I met, we both had pretty much nothing. We had virtually no savings. I hadn't quite yet finished undergrad. And we were living in a crummy one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where we were assaulted for being a gay couple and where the police harassed us for complaining about it. This did not feel like marrying up, especially because the domestic partnership that we had at that time was only legally recognized within the city limits of West Hollywood. Several years into being domestically partnered, my in-laws were able to help us with the down payment on our very first home. It was a condo. By marrying into the middle class, I suddenly benefited from that generational family wealth that you cannot build anymore if you do not start in it. My grandparents did own homes, and they had money to pass to the next generation, but they had several children, and the next generation had several children. So by the time it all got to me, it had been spent mostly on medical bills for pre-existing conditions that insurance was not required to cover. From all 4 of my grandparents and both of my parents, I inherited a grand total of less than $2,000. For those in my generation who are what you would call well-employed, and that's certainly me, this is what work life is like for us today compared to when we were young, or younger. When I was in my 20s and 30s, no matter where I worked, I always promoted really quickly and I got really good raises. I used to be a highly valued employee. My entire working adult life, I have never come into work late. I have never left work early. I rarely call in sick. I often work through part or all of my lunch. And I usually find more efficient and better ways of doing things that either save or make a lot of money from my employer. I still do all of that now, and I do it with a master's degree in business administration and decades of work experience. But what I get for that now is I get to keep my job. I don't get raises. I don't get promotions. Where I've worked for the last 7 years, raises for everyone have been capped at a maximum of 2%, and you're lucky if you get that much. The cost of everything has gone up more than 2% a year, so technically I bring home less now than I did 7 years ago. And I had an excellent job. My job is the envy of many, and I was one of several hundred applicants for that job. I am correctly described as one of the lucky ones. My generation is struggling, and a lot of us have our adult children living with us because they have to. And a lot of us who still have parents are living with them because we have to. We can get jobs in department stores, but the living that we can make off of those jobs is nothing in comparison to previous generations. My father-in-law supported himself, his wife, and his oldest child, and put himself through college, through undergrad, with no student loans, all while working at a department store. That oldest child of his is my husband's older brother, and he has 2 boys, our nephews. We are the favorite uncles, for very good reason. I love living every day in the certainty that my nephew's futures are secure. Everything that Jason and I have, and everything that my brother-in-law and his wife have, and for that matter, everything my mother and father-in-law have, everything the 6 of us have worked our whole lives for is going to funnel down to those 2 boys, eventually. They can be total screw-ups, and they're still going to be safe. They are going to inherit wealth without work. And you know what? I like that. If I'm being honest, I like that. It gives me huge peace of mind. I know that it's not fair. I've lived unfair. Many aspects of my life have been the definition of unfair, but that doesn't mean that I want anyone else to experience that. Certainly not my nephews. I also don't believe that it's necessary to disadvantage someone else so that my nephews can have a secure future. It does not have to be one or the other. The last disturbing statistic for today is this, and I know a lot of you already know this one. There are 62 people in the world today who have more wealth than half the entire population combined, that half totaling more than 3.7 billion individuals. The number of people who can comfortably fit in a room half the size of the one we're in right now, 62 individuals, have more wealth than half the entire human population of the planet combined. For me, this is not a question of economic fairness or justice. It's a question of common sense. Every time you go into a business to spend money, that requires the business owner to hire people to wait on you. That gives people jobs. Customers having enough money to spend and then going into businesses to spend is what creates jobs, not tax breaks to the business owners. When you give tax breaks to the business owners, they do not use the extra money to hire a bunch of people to just stand around doing nothing all day. They use the extra money to buy themselves better homes, better cars, nicer vacations. Companies only hire more people when more customers generate more work that needs to be done. It is common sense to me that 62 people, each buying a pair of jeans and going out to dinner, is not going to employ nearly as many individuals as millions and millions of people, each buying a pair of jeans and going out to dinner. More money in more hands was that magic 3 decades of the 1950s, the 60s, and the 70s, when a majority of people who became very well off worked for their money rather than inherited it. During that 30-year period, and for the 30 years leading up to it, people like those 62 individuals were taxed at a rate of at least 70%. This was my childhood, when public schools had plenty of money for everything that they needed. Unions were strong, minimum wage was much higher when compared to the cost of living, and even if you didn't have a union job, you could leave your job to go get a union job. So non-unionized industries had to pay their employees more to keep them. When you put your starter home up for sale, more people were able to buy that because unionized workers could afford it, and you could move up. The labor that fast food workers and mall workers provide today for their employers is no less valuable to their employers or to our economy than factory workers of the 1950s. But today's mall and fast food workers cannot afford to buy homes on what they're paid. In the 1980s, that rich people 70% tax rate was dropped all the way down to 15%. So it was cut by 55%. What stuns me is how many people don't see that our government's income, what it can spend, comes from our taxes. So if you cut the tax rate by 55%, you cut the government's income by 55%. What would happen to you if a good chunk of your income dropped by 55%? The theory behind this tax cut was that the more people that you have paying a small tax, the higher the government's income. So theoretically, taxing a small handful of people, 70%, was not going to get nearly as much money coming into the government as taxing millions and millions of people, a tiny percent. And that does make sense on paper. That is mathematically correct. In the reality of life, however, if a handful of people has $1 billion that you can tax, and everyone else combined has $11 between them, you're not going to get more money coming into the government. And that's exactly what happened. Starting in the 1980s, a huge chunk of our government's revenues dropped dramatically. So even if we had never increased government spending at all, not by 1 penny since the 1980s, our revenues have been so low since that tax rate going down by 55% that things have been slowly getting disastrous ever since. I think it's worth examining raising taxes on the rich back up to 70%. And this does not have to kick in until, say, income above $1 million a year, whatever the figure is. But anytime this is suggested, alarmists start acting like everyone in this room is going to start paying 70%, and it's just not true. I want to be really clear about this. I'm not talking about taxing a handful of billionaires. I'm talking about taxing millionaires. The US population is now well over 250 million people. And the result of that is that according to Credit Suisse's Global Wealth in 2015 report, there are now 16 million US citizens who are millionaires. That really surprised me. To put that into context, only 4 of our 50 United States have statewide populations that are larger than 16 million. 46 states have whole populations that are less than those 16 million wealthy Americans. If you raise their taxes back up to 70%, some of them are going to start having to live on something closer to 9 million a year instead of 30-something million a year. Living on just $25,000 a day, 7 days a week, I can't imagine would be that much harder than living on 82 grand a day. I mean, there's just so much money that you can spend in a given day, every single day. If we can ever get our tax laws changed, which I don't see happening anytime soon, considering how our government currently is and what it's about to become, but if we could, if my nephews were to someday inherit only enough money to buy 3 or 4 houses cash, instead of a couple dozen houses cash, I'm okay with that. Many people are not okay with that. They want to leave as much as they possibly can, even if it's obscene amounts of money. And this does not come from a place of greed. It comes from a place of anxiety, of wanting to do as much as you possibly can for someone that you love after you're incapable of doing anything for them at all. This is not a good mindset in which to make decisions. Fear is never a good mindset in which to make decisions. And the more wealth without work that exists in America, the longer extreme income inequality exists in America, the easier it is to maintain that fear and the status quo and possibly make it all a whole lot worse. There are many stories that I could tell you about myself and my husband that I don't have time to go into now, but a quirky coincidence about both of us is that before we met each other, we each had fairly wealthy individuals who were romantically interested in each of us. And like a couple of happy idiots, we chose each other instead. We married for love. To this day, I can still drown in those beautiful blue eyes of my husband's. But it's not really his eyes that I'm looking at, it's his soul. My heart sings for Jason in a way that it never has for anyone else. It is a wealth of love. And like most great wealth, I am certain that it began in the distant past. But that's a whole different talk for a whole different day. May we each go forward this day, and in all days to come, in a wealth of love, a wealth of friendship and good health. May we each experience for the first time, or maybe acknowledge for the first time, an embarrassment of riches that moves us to share our various kinds of wealth with others. May we all have peace of mind. Amen. Shalom. Namaste. And blessed be.